The air in the bridal suite at the St. Regis in New York was a costly perfume of white lilies and hairspray. Isabella Izzy Rossi adjusted her Italian lace veil, a legacy from her grandmother, and smiled at her reflection. The ivory satin dress embraced her curves with an elegance that took her breath away. Everything was perfect. A meticulously planned perfection. Every detail, from the pearls at her neckline to the choice of St. Patrick's Cathedral, was a testament to the love she believed she was celebrating. She clutched a small silver locket in her hand, a gift from her fiancé, Alex Sterling. Inside, a tiny photo of the two of them, smiling on a pier in Montauk. "Forever starts now," he had whispered when he gave it to her. Meanwhile, a few blocks away, outside the majestic cathedral, Alex Sterling did not share his fiancé's serenity. He adjusted his bow tie for the 10th time, sweat beading on his forehead despite the crisp October breeze. His best man, David, patted his shoulder. "Man, relax. It's just the rest of your life. Have you seen Izzy? She looks stunning." Alex forced a smile that didn't reach his worried blue eyes. "I know, she's everything." But his gaze constantly drifted to a black limousine parked across the street, a vehicle that wasn't part of the wedding's fleet. He pulled out his phone, looked at the dark screen, and quickly put it away, as if the device burned him. The organ music began to resonate, its imposing notes filling the cathedral's stone nave and silencing the hum of the guests. The massive doors opened. There was Izzy on her father's arm, an angel in satin and lace. Her smile was radiant, her eyes fixed on Alex waiting at the altar. For a moment, the whole world narrowed to that aisle, to the promise in his eyes. Then, she saw her. No, not just Alex. Standing beside him, positioned with a presumptuous familiarity that made Izzy's blood run cold, was Chloe, Alex's ex-girlfriend. The woman whose shadow he swore he had left behind. The woman who was synonymous with complicated past. Chloe wore a cobalt blue dress that was a little too loud for a guest, but perfect for someone who wanted to make a statement. A smug smile played on her lips as her gaze met Izzy's from across the aisle. Izzy's smile wavered and died. The warmth in her chest was replaced by a knot of ice. Whispers erupted among the guests like a fire in dry grass. Izzy's father squeezed her arm, a gesture of confused support. "What is she doing here?" he murmured, his voice strained. Izzy couldn't answer. Her gaze shot to Alex, a silent, desperate question in her eyes. He didn't meet it. Instead, he looked at the floor, at his expensive shoes, anywhere but at the woman he was about to marry. The betrayal was so palpable, it was suffocating. An act of public humiliation so cruel it felt unreal. Time seemed to stop. Izzy was frozen at the start of the aisle, the organ music hanging in the air like a bad joke. Her dream wedding had turned into her worst nightmare in under 30 seconds. But before a single tear could fall, before rage could erupt into words, an unexpected movement broke the spell. Father Michael, a white-haired man with a kind face who had known the Rossi family for years, raised a hand to the organist, silencing the music. With an expression of solemn seriousness, he walked down the altar steps, completely ignoring Alex and his unwanted guest. He walked with a firm purpose down the aisle, stopping directly in front of Izzy. His eyes held no pity, but a kind of resolute strength. He held a thin manila folder. In a low but perfectly clear tone that only Izzy and her father could hear, he said, "Isabella, I was praying I wouldn't need this." He opened the folder, revealing a set of legal documents. At the top of the first page, in unmistakable capital letters, Izzy read the words, "Petition for annulment." The shock of Chloe's presence was instantly eclipsed by a dizzying wave of confusion. How? Why? Why was the priest, the man who was supposed to unite them, handing her the tool to undo them before the vows were even exchanged? In that moment, Izzy realized that Alex's betrayal was far deeper and darker than she could have ever imagined. The expensive parchment of the annulment papers felt like an insult in Father Michael's hands. Marco Rossi, Izzy's father, a man whose fortune in the construction business was built with the same solidity as his fists, took the file. His eyes, which moments before had shone with paternal pride, were now hard as flint. He flipped through the papers, his face moving, from confusion to a cold, controlled fury. He didn't need to read the details. He understood the big picture the instant his gaze crossed from Alex to Chloe. This wasn't a mistake. It was an ambush. Izzy's world, once expansive and full of light, shrank to the aisle of that cathedral. The buzzing in her ears drowned out the shocked murmurs of the guests. The Rossi clan, occupying the first 5 rows, was a study in Italian physiognomy. Shock turning to anger, aunts making the sign of the cross, cousins whose broad shoulders looked ready for violence. This was her world, a fortress of family loyalty forged in Naples and tempered in the streets of the Bronx. They weren't just family. They were a legion. In contrast, Alex's side was a sea of pale faces from Connecticut high society. The Sterlings and their guests seemed more concerned with the breach of decorum than with the heartbroken bride. Alex's mother, Eleanor Sterling, a woman whose backbone was stiffer than her forced smile, looked at the scene with cold disdain, as if she were watching a tasteless play. It was clear that for the Sterlings, the marriage was less a union of souls and more a merger of portfolios. Izzy, with her passion and her vibrant, loud family, had always been a little too exotic for them. Alex finally found his voice, a pathetic plea. "Izzy, wait, I can explain. It's not what it looks like." But it was exactly what it looked like. Chloe, the antagonist in cobalt blue, took a step forward, placing a possessive hand on Alex's arm. The gesture was subtle, but it screamed victory. She turned to Izzy, a fake smile of sympathy on her face. "Honey, it's for your own good," she said, her voice dripping with sweet poison. "Alex and I have unfinished business. It would be cruel to drag you into this." Chloe wasn't just an ex-girlfriend. She was the daughter of a business rival of Alex's father. Her reappearance wasn't about lost love. It was about power, about a corporate alliance that Alex had evidently chosen over his marriage. He wasn't just an unfaithful fiancé. He was a coward who had sold out his bride for a better deal. It was then that Father Michael's role became clear. He wasn't just a priest. He had been a Rossi family confidant for over 30 years. He had baptized Izzy, given her first communion. He was part of the family. "Marco," he said in a low voice to Izzy's father, "I received an anonymous email last night with copies of airline tickets, Las Vegas, 3 days ago. Alex and a Miss Vance." He didn't need to say anything else. The email included a copy of a marriage certificate. The annulment wasn't a precaution, it was a legal necessity. Alex couldn't marry Izzy because somewhere in the Nevada records he was already married to Chloe. The revelation hung in the air, heavier than incense. Marco Rossi didn't say a word. He simply looked at Alex with a contempt so deep it seemed to suck all the air out of the room. Then, he turned to his 2 sons, Antonio and Leo, sitting in the front row. A single nod of the head was all the instruction needed. They stood up, their expensive suits unable to hide the menace in their posture. They flanked Izzy, a human shield against the humiliation. As they guided her back down the aisle, past the shocked and embarrassed faces, Izzy finally raised her head. Her gaze swept past Alex's mother, who averted her face and landed on Alex, now pale and cornered beside his new, or perhaps old, partner. Stepping out into the cool Manhattan air, the fog of shock began to dissipate, replaced by a cold, cutting clarity. The pain was there, an open wound in her chest. But beneath the pain, something else was starting to burn. An ember of fury. The humiliation they had planned for her in front of her family in a sacred place. They had no idea who they were dealing with. They hadn't destroyed Isabella Rossi. They had just created her. The ride from Manhattan to the Rossi estate in Westchester was made in a heavy silence, broken only by the muffled sobs of Izzy's mother, Sophia. The wedding reception, intended for over 300 guests, was set up in the vast backyard, a cruel mockery of white tents and immaculate flowers. Inside the house, in the oak-paneled library, the Rossi family formed a war council. Izzy sat in a leather armchair, still in her wedding dress, the surreal image of a deposed queen. But there were no tears. Her eyes were dry, fixed on a spot on the wall, her mind replaying the humiliation scene by scene. Her younger brother, Leo, a man with the build of a linebacker and the temper of a volcano, paced back and forth. "I'm going to find him," he growled, hitting his fist into his palm. "I swear to God, Alex Sterling won't walk straight for a month." "And what would that solve?" retorted Antonio, the older brother. He was on his laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard. As the brains behind the family business's legal expansion, his mind operated in terms of strategy, not brute force. "They expect that from us, Leo. The caricature of the hot-headed Italian family. It would be playing their game. This isn't about a punch in the face. This is about the attempted merger of Sterling Industries with Vance Global. The betrayal was just the seal on the contract." Marco Rossi remained silent, watching his sons, but his gaze was on Izzy. He knew her. He knew the strength that hid beneath her gentleness, the steel in her spine she had inherited from her mother. He was waiting. Then Izzy spoke, and her voice cut the tension like a blade of ice. "No." Everyone turned to her. "None of you are going to do anything." She stood up, the satin of her dress whispering with the movement. The wounded bride had disappeared, replaced by a woman whose calm was more frightening than Leo's fury. "This was done to me. The humiliation was mine. So, the response will be mine too." She turned to Antonio. "The merger. What do you know about it?" Antonio, caught off guard by his sister's shift, blinked. "It's a hostile takeover disguised. Sterling Industries is bleeding money. They need Vance Global's capital to stay afloat. Alex's marriage to Chloe seals the deal, unites the families, and saves Alex's company from bankruptcy." Meanwhile, in a penthouse on Park Avenue with a view of Central Park, the mood was anything but celebratory. Alex was drinking an expensive whiskey, his hand trembling slightly. "Did it have to be this way, Chloe? In front of everyone? Her family?" Chloe, who had changed out of her blue dress into an elegant silk robe, looked at him with contempt. "Don't be naive, Alex. It had to be public, undeniable. A quiet annulment would leave us vulnerable to lawsuits, to claims that I forced you. Now the whole world has seen you choose me." She picked up her phone. "My father is pleased. The board is on our side. The humiliation of Isabella Rossi is just a small piece of collateral damage in the grand scheme of things." Antonio's phone vibrated. He read the screen and his expression darkened. Bastards. He showed the phone to the family. A major New York gossip blog already had the story, citing an anonymous source close to the Sterling family. The article spoke of a rekindled romance, and Alex's difficult but necessary decision, praising his courage. Subtly, it painted the Rossis as tragic but peripheral figures who would need to accept the situation. They weren't just controlling the narrative, they were erasing Izzy from the story. That was the last straw. That cold, calculated condescension ignited the ember of Izzy's fury into a blaze. "They think they can sweep us under the rug with a press release," she said, her voice low and dangerous. She walked up to her father. The power in the room visibly shifted, consolidating around her. "Father, they have underestimated us. They see a tearful bride and a loud immigrant family. They don't see who we truly are." She turned to her brothers. "Antonio, I want all financial reports, all vulnerabilities, all hidden debts of Sterling Industries. I want to know where every penny is buried. Leo, I don't want you to beat him up. I want you to follow him, find out where they're celebrating tonight. I want to know their every move." She then turned to her mother, who was watching her with a new light in her eyes, a recognition of shared strength. "Mother, call Uncle Mateo. Tell him I'm going to need the best divorce and corporate litigation lawyer in New York. Their engagement party has just begun, but my revenge party is about to be planned." The Rossi Library, once a sanctuary of tranquility, transformed into the nerve center of a corporate war. Morning sun found Isabella, no longer in her wedding satin, but in impeccably tailored black pants and a silk blouse, her hair pulled back in a severe bun. The transformation was complete. Beside her was her uncle, Matteo Rossi, a man whose reputation in the New York courts was as legendary as it was feared. His shark-like eyes analyzed the situation with a predatory calm. They made the classic mistake of the arrogant, Matteo said, his fingertips pressed together. They thought the attack would be so overwhelming there would be no retaliation. The annulment protects you legally, Izzy, but this isn't about the law. It's about dismantling them. Piece by piece. While her uncle outlined the legal strategy, Antonio was immersed in the digital world. I have something, he said, turning his laptop around. The email to Father Michael. It was sent from an encrypted account, but I managed to trace the first server hop. The signal came from a coffee shop in the financial district, a place notoriously used by low to mid-level Sterling Industries employees during lunch. He looked at Izzy. Someone inside wanted this to happen. We have an ally in enemy territory. This revelation opened a new dimension to Izzy's plan. It wasn't just the Rossi family against the Sterlings. There was internal dissent to be exploited. Find out who, she ordered. Discreetly. The complexity increased when Leo arrived, throwing an envelope onto the mahogany table. Inside, grainy long-distance photos. Alex and Chloe's celebration wasn't at a trendy restaurant, but at the somber Sterling mansion in Greenwich. The photos showed a tense gathering in the courtyard. Richard Sterling, the family patriarch, stood, his face red with anger, gesturing not at the Rossis but at his own son and his new daughter-in-law. Chloe looked defiant, while Alex looked like a boy caught in the act. Old man Sterling doesn't look happy, said Leo. I think he approved of the deal, but not the method. He looked embarrassed. There it was, the first crack in the enemy's armor. The Sterling-Vance alliance wasn't as solid as it seemed. Richard Sterling, a man of the old guard who valued reputation above all else, was clearly in conflict with the scorched earth tactic of Chloe and her father. The pressure mounted when Antonio discovered the final piece of the puzzle. The press conference to officially announce the merger is scheduled, in 48 hours. The clock was ticking. Once the announcement was made and the markets reacted, reversing the damage would be nearly impossible. Any action had to be fast, precise, and devastating. Izzy absorbed it all, her brain connecting the dots with frightening speed. The internal informant, Richard Sterling's anger, the 48-hour deadline. She walked to a whiteboard they had brought into the library and picked up a marker. Leo, she said, her voice firm, forget Alex. I want you to find a man named Marcus Thorne. He was the CFO of Sterling Industries for 20 years. Richard fired him 6 months ago. Antonio raised his eyebrows. Thorne was fired for irreconcilable differences. Rumors say he strongly opposed the idea of a merger with Vance Global. Exactly, said Izzy, writing Marcus Thorne at the top of the board. A disgruntled, fired CFO with intimate knowledge of all the company's financial irregularities is the perfect profile for our informant. She drew a line connecting Thorne to the internal ally. They gave us 48 hours, she continued, looking at her family, her war team. That's more than enough time. Antonio, prepare a dossier on every regulatory violation Thorne might know about. Uncle Matteo, prepare the papers for a lawsuit that will freeze every asset they have. Leo, bring me Marcus Thorne. She circled Richard Sterling's name on the board and wrote next to it, Fracture Point. We're going to give Richard a choice, she said, a dangerous glint in her eyes. He can either sink with his son and Chloe's ship, or he can help us build a lifeboat. With pleasure. The gears of revenge begin to turn, and the turning point is approaching. Leo Rossi was not a man of subtleties, but he was effective. 20. Hours after receiving his mission, he was at the door of Matteo Rossi's law office, accompanied by a middle-aged man in an impeccable suit, whose expression was a mix of caution and determination. Marcus Thorne, the former CFO of Sterling Industries, didn't look like a man broken by dismissal. He looked like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. He entered the conference room where Izzy, her father, and Antonio were waiting for him. Matteo presided over the meeting, ensuring everything was protected by attorney-client privilege. Thorne dispensed with the preliminaries. I was the one who sent the email to Father Michael, he said, his voice calm and precise. I owed that to Richard. He would never have approved of the way this was done. But my real motive was to stop the merger at all costs. Izzy watched him, impassive. Why? Wasn't it just a bad deal? Thorne allowed himself a grim smile. A bad deal would be an improvement. The merger is a criminal act. He opened his leather briefcase and slid a series of documents across the polished table. Sterling Industries isn't just bleeding money, it's hemorrhaging, but not because of the market. He paused, ensuring the full impact of his next words. It's because of Alex. The air in the room grew thicker. For the past 18 months, while Richard was recovering from his heart surgery and left Alex as interim CEO, your fiancé, he looked at Izzy with a hint of sympathy, embezzled over $20 million from the company's coffers. A shocked silence fell over the room. Marco Rossi looked as if he had been physically hit. Antonio looked at the papers, incredulous. 20 million? Antonio whispered. For what? Gambling debts, Thorne replied. Apparently, the golden boy has a gambling addiction he can't control. He was weeks away from an audit that would expose him and bankrupt the company. The merger with Vance Global wasn't a lifeboat, it was the getaway vehicle. A way to bury his crimes under a mountain of acquisition paperwork where no one would ever find them. The betrayal, the humiliation, everything was recontextualized in an instant. It wasn't about a rekindled love. It wasn't even about a cold business choice. It was about a weak man's desperate criminal self-preservation. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come. And it was Chloe who found out, Thorne continued, handing over another folder. This one contained transcripts of emails and message logs. She wasn't a reluctant accomplice. She was the architect. She discovered Alex's embezzlement 3 months ago. Instead of exposing him, she saw an opportunity. It was she who took the information to her father. It was she who structured the merger deal, turning it into a predatory acquisition. And it was she who used the embezzlement as blackmail to force Alex to agree. Izzy's face was a mask of ice. The pain in her chest had solidified into something heavy and dangerous. Chloe hadn't humiliated her as a side effect. She had used her as a tool. The spectacle in the church wasn't just to solidify the deal, it was Chloe's personal triumph, a demonstration of power, using Izzy's humiliation as a smokescreen to hide the rot underneath. She wasn't the other woman. She was the puppet master. Uncle Mateo leaned forward, a hungry glint in his eyes. This changes everything. His voice was almost a purr. Bigamy and public humiliation are ammunition for a civil war. But embezzlement, corporate fraud, blackmail. Isabella, this isn't a lawsuit. This is a warrant for their arrest. This is the end of everything for them. The turning point had arrived and shattered the landscape of revenge. The goal was no longer about saving face or seeking financial compensation. The goal was annihilation. Izzy stood up and walked to the large window overlooking the city. The reflection showed a woman she barely recognized. The engagement, the love, the pain, it all seemed to belong to another life. She turned, and the coldness in her eyes made even her uncle take a step back. Uncle Mateo, prepare the documents, not for a civil lawsuit, for the district attorney's office, she ordered. Antonio, use this data to prepare an anonymous report. For the Vance Global Board, show them exactly what kind of fraud they're merging with. Father, I need you to make a call to Richard Sterling. Set up a meeting. For tomorrow morning. Tell him his new daughter-in-law is offering his son one last chance to choose his legacy. State's witness or co-defendant. The clock was ticking. There were just over 24 hours left. But now Izzy was no longer playing defense. She was holding the gun that could bring down 2 empires. The air in Mateo's office was thick with potential. Every person in the room was a loaded weapon, and Isabella had just aimed them at the enemy's heart. Marco Rossi, with a clenched jaw, dialed Richard, Sterling's private number. The call was answered on the second ring. Marco wasted no time with pleasantries. His voice was devoid of emotion, which made it all the more menacing. Richard, it's me. We have a problem. One that involves the future of your son, your company, and possibly your freedom. On the other end of the line, the silence was an admission of panic. My daughter Isabella is willing to meet with you. Tomorrow at 10 in the morning, at my lawyer's office, alone. Consider this your only opportunity to hear her offer before this file in front of me goes to the district attorney's desk. The pause stretched. Marco could almost hear the gears turning in Richard Sterling's mind, the frantic calculation, the fear. The answer came, weak but affirmative. I'll be there. The first domino had fallen. At the Greenwich mansion, Richard Sterling hung up the phone with a trembling hand. His face, normally ruddy and authoritative, was pale. Alex and Chloe, who had been discussing the details of the press conference, fell silent. "What was that, Richard?" Chloe asked, her voice tinged with impatience. Richard shot his own son, a look of pure contempt. "That was Marco Rossi," he said, his voice hoarse. "It seems your little display of power had consequences. They know. Somehow they know everything." For the first time, Chloe's smug smile faltered. "That's impossible. They have nothing." "They have enough to get a meeting with me and mention the district attorney in the same sentence," Richard retorted. "You two, with your arrogance, have just turned a business problem into an existential crisis." The alliance, once cemented by greed, began to crack under the weight of fear. Alex, pale, looked like he was about to faint. He wasn't a master criminal. He was a scared kid about to get caught. Meanwhile, in a quiet corner of the Rossi library, the second front of the attack was opened. Antonio, with the precision of a surgeon, compiled Thorne's most incriminating documents. Bank statements showing the embezzlement, internal emails discussing Sterling Industries' dire financial situation, into a secure digital file. He sent it anonymously to the lead director on the Vance Global Board, a woman known for her ruthless reputation. The subject line: "A background check your team failed to perform." The ticking time bomb was planted in the center of the enemy camp. That night, Izzy returned to her room. Her wedding dress was still there, draped over an armchair, an empty shell of the woman she had been less than 36 hours ago. She looked at it without emotion, an artifact of a past life. Her mother, Sophia, entered silently, not with words of comfort, but with sharp wisdom. "Your grandfather always said," Sophia began, her voice soft but firm, "revenge is a dish best served cold. In the heat of anger, you only burn yourself." She placed a hand on Izzy's shoulder. "Make sure your head is as cold as your heart has become, Isabella. Only then will you win." Izzy nodded, absorbing the matriarchal strength that flowed from her. The tears had dried. The pain had turned into purpose. She picked up a framed photo from her nightstand, a picture of her and Alex in the Hamptons, laughing, the sun on their faces. She studied his smile, the ease of his lie. Then she looked at her own reflection in the glass. The girl in that photo was dead, and he had killed her. But the woman who had replaced her was someone not even Chloe Sterling would see coming. She was ready for the meeting. At 10 a.m. sharp, Richard Sterling was led into an austere conference room on the 50th floor of a midtown skyscraper. The room belonged to Matteo Rossi's office, a place where careers and fortunes were routinely dismantled. There was no coffee or water on the table. Just Isabella, sitting alone at one end of the long glass table, the New York skyline framing her like a halo of power. Richard, accustomed to dominating any room he entered, immediately felt at a disadvantage. He expected to face Marco or an army of lawyers. Instead, he found the young woman his family had tried to crush. She didn't look like a victim. Dressed in a charcoal gray pantsuit that was the very definition of authority, she watched him with her mother's eyes and her father's coolness. "Thank you for coming, Richard," Izzy said, her voice calm and level, with no trace of the jilted bride's trembling. Richard cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "Look, Isabella, what Alex did was inexcusable. We're prepared to offer a generous financial settlement." Izzy raised a hand, silencing him mid-sentence. The gesture was so bold and definitive that it caught him off guard. "I'm not here to discuss a handout, Richard. And I'm not here to talk about my hurt feelings. I'm here to talk about Article 180 of the New York Penal Code, corporate fraud, a Class B felony which can lead to 25 years in prison." Richard's face lost all color. "Your son embezzled $20 million, Izzy continued as if discussing the weather. Your company is insolvent. The merger with Vance isn't a deal. It's a criminal cover-up orchestrated by your new daughter-in-law. She paused, letting the weight of her words fill the silence. I have proof. Documents, bank statements, testimonies. Enough evidence to ensure Alex spends the prime of his life in a cell and that the Sterling name becomes synonymous with disgrace. This wasn't an emotional plea. It was an execution. Izzy's growth was evident. She was no longer reacting to pain. She was in total control of the situation, using cold logic and the law as her weapons. She had overcome the need to scream or cry, transcending personal pain to become a strategic force. So, here is my offer, she said, leaning forward. It's not a negotiation, it's the only way out you have. She pushed a single document across the table. This is a cooperation agreement. You will go to the press conference tomorrow, but instead of announcing a merger, you will announce the restructuring of Sterling Industries. You will announce that you have discovered accounting irregularities and that your son, Alex, has been removed from all duties, effective immediately, while a full investigation is conducted. Richard looked at her, stunned. That will destroy us. Vance will sue us. No, they won't, Izzy said with confidence, because at this very moment, the Vance board is reviewing an anonymous dossier that details my ex-fiancé's fraud. They won't sue you. They'll run for the hills to disassociate themselves from you. I'm giving you a way to get ahead of the story, to paint yourself as the honest father who is cleaning up his dishonest son's mess. And Alex, Richard whispered. That brings us to the second part of my offer, Izzy said, her gaze hardening. Alex will plead guilty to lesser charges. With your full cooperation, maybe he'll get a reduced sentence. Without it, I'll bury him. She stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. You have until 9 tonight to give me your answer. If you don't call, my uncle will personally deliver the file to the prosecutor at 9 tomorrow morning. It was a pleasure doing business with you, Richard. She walked out of the room, leaving the Sterling patriarch trembling, not with anger, but with dread. Isabella Rossi had not just overcome the betrayal. She had become the personification of consequences. The next 12 hours were the most tense of their lives. The Rossi house operated with the silent precision of a military command. The subplots, carefully woven by Izzy, were ready to be resolved, converging toward the climax at the press conference. Antonio monitored financial news feeds and online forums. The silence from the Vance Global side was deafening. The anonymous dossier had hit its target. There were no leaks, no statements, which meant the board was in a panic, locked in emergency meetings, trying to calculate the best way to distance themselves from the impending disaster without causing a market collapse. The absence of news was the best news possible. Leo was discreetly positioned outside the office of Chloe's father, the feared Vance Global magnate. He reported a constant stream of lawyers entering and exiting the building. They were preparing for war, but they didn't know the main battle had already been lost. The strongest tension, however, revolved around Marco Rossi's phone. Izzy's deadline for Richard Sterling, 9 at night, was approaching. Every minute that passed increased the possibility of all-out war. Marco, normally a man of action, was motionless, respecting his daughter's leadership. He looked at Izzy, who was calmly reviewing notes with Matteo, her steel composure being the rock for everyone's anxiety. At 8:58 p.m., 2 minutes before the deadline, the phone rang. Marco answered on speakerphone. Richard Sterling's voice on the other end was hoarse, defeated. I accept, he said. We have a deal. A collective sigh of relief and triumph swept through the room. The main subplot was resolved. The enemy was not just divided. Its leader had surrendered and become a pawn in Izzy's game. Immediately, the final phase of the plan went into action. Matteo emailed the carefully crafted talking points for Richard's press conference speech. Antonio prepared a Rossi Holdings press release announcing a potential emergency credit line for Sterling Industries, positioning them not as destroyers, but as saviors, a masterstroke of public relations. Meanwhile, Izzy prepared for her own role the next day. She wouldn't be at the press conference. Her revenge wasn't about being in the spotlight. It was about watching from afar as the empire that scorned her collapsed under its own weight, with her pulling the strings. The final scene of the preparation happens late at night. Izzy is alone in the library, looking at the whiteboard now covered in plans, lines, and crossed-out names. The name Alex is circled in red. She thinks of him, not with hatred, but with a kind of cold pity. He was just the catalyst, the weak fool who set everything in motion. The real target had always been the system that protected him, the arrogance, the cruelty, and the certainty that they could humiliate a little girl without consequence. The preparation for the climax was complete. All the pieces were in their places on the board. Now, all that was left was to watch the checkmate. The ballroom at the Four Seasons was packed. The cream of New York's financial press had gathered for what they expected to be the triumphant announcement of the Sterling-Vance merger. In the front row, Chloe Sterling, née Vance, sat with a radiant smile, wearing a blood-red dress that exuded power. Beside her, Alex looked nervous, but tried to project confidence. They were the couple of the moment, the victors. In a luxury suite upstairs, overlooking the ballroom via a live feed on a huge screen, Isabella Rossi watched. With her were her father, brothers, and uncle. There was no champagne, just the tense quiet of anticipation. On the podium, Richard Sterling approached the microphone. He looked older, his face etched with the tension of the previous night. He looked at his son and his daughter-in-law in the front row. Chloe's smile was one of smug encouragement. She believed he was about to cement their triumph. Richard began, his voice firm but loaded with a gravity that immediately silenced the room. "Good morning. I have called you here today to discuss the future of Sterling Industries." He paused. Over the past 48 hours, an internal audit has revealed serious and deep financial irregularities in our company. A murmur went through the crowd. In the front row, Chloe's smile froze. Alex's face turned white as a ghost. "These irregularities," Richard continued, his voice gaining strength, "point to grave mismanagement and potential fraudulent activity. Effective immediately, my son, Alexander Sterling, has been removed from all his duties at the company, while we cooperate fully with an external investigation." Chaos erupted. Camera flashes fired incessantly in the direction of Alex and Chloe. Reporters shouted questions. Chloe's face was a mask of fury and disbelief. She turned to Alex, who seemed to have shrunk in his chair, unable to meet her gaze. But the most spectacular twist was yet to come. Richard raised his hands for silence. "Due to this situation, the proposed merger with Vance Global is, of course, cancelled." At that exact moment, the cell phones of every reporter in the room vibrated with a news alert. A press release from Vance Global had been issued. Vance Global withdraws its merger offer with Sterling Industries due to concerns with due diligence and corporate governance. It was the 1-2 punch. Izzy and Antonio had not only given Vance a heads up, but they had also timed their response to coincide with Richard's announcement, making it seem as if Vance was abandoning a sinking ship, maximizing the Sterling's humiliation. Chloe stood up, her face twisted with rage, and hissed at Richard, "You're destroying this family!" But her voice was lost in the tumult. And then came Izzy's coup de grace. While Alex was paralyzed by shock and Chloe was fruitlessly trying to maintain composure, two men in dark suits and official appearance discreetly entered the ballroom. They approached the front row, and one of them spoke in a low but firm voice to Alex. "Alexander Sterling, you are under arrest on suspicion of embezzlement and fraud." Alex's world came crashing down. The camera flashes became a storm of light as the detectives escorted him out, his hands cuffed behind his back. The final image of the climax was not of Izzy, but of Chloe, left alone in the front row, her red dress now looking the color of defeat. Her face a mixture of impotent fury as she watched the man she bought and the empire she tried to steal being led away in disgrace. In the suite upstairs, the silence was broken. No one applauded. Marco placed a proud hand on his daughter's shoulder. Isabella watched the screen, Chloe's face contorted in defeat, and felt no joy. She felt no hatred. She just felt the end. The scales of justice, which had been so violently unbalanced, had finally returned to their place. Isabella's transformation was complete. She hadn't just gotten revenge, she had rewritten the very definition of power. In the weeks that followed, the collapse of the Sterling-Vance deal was the dominant story on Wall Street. The fall was swift and brutal. Sterling Industries, exposed and leaderless, filed for bankruptcy. Richard Sterling, by positioning himself as the whistleblower, managed to save a fragment of his reputation but lost the empire his father had built. He retired in silent disgrace. Alex Sterling, faced with overwhelming evidence and his own father's betrayal, accepted a plea deal. The image of him, trading his expensive suits for an orange prison jumpsuit, became the visual epilogue to his arrogance. His sentence was 5 to 7 years in a minimum security prison, a stunning fall for Manhattan's golden boy. Chloe was perhaps the one who suffered the most poetically just fate. While she could not be legally implicated in Alex's fraud, her reputation was irrevocably stained. The Vance Global Board, in an effort to distance themselves from the scandal, forced her father's retirement and removed her from any position of power. She, who saw people as chess pieces, became a pariah in the world she had worked so hard to conquer. She kept her wealth but lost what she valued most: status and control. She was trapped in a gilded cage of her own making forever, remembered not as a magnate, but as the architect of one of the most spectacular corporate self-destructions.